What's up everyone, welcome back to another episode of Theology Matters. Have you ever had someone pick up a Bible and basically tell you that anything and everything you need to know in life is written right here in this text? As if anyone at any place or any time can pick up this collection of books and interpret it in the same exact way and come out with the exact same meaning? Well, I know that I have, and if you're like me, you may have asked how anyone can claim that a set of texts written thousands of years ago in a language that many of us can't even read or comprehend can be self-evident. In this video, we're going to explore the topic of hermeneutics, and we're going to talk about how some of these questions have drastically challenged the way that we do theology today. Let's get growing. Before we talk about the impacts that hermeneutics has on theology today, I think it's important to briefly mention the Enlightenment and to revisit a conversation that we had in a previous video on revelation and knowledge of God. Roughly 300 years ago, there was this thing called the Enlightenment that came about, where everything that we knew about the world was kind of thrown into question and everything began to slowly change from old ways of thinking to a new perspective. Before the Enlightenment, theology was often viewed as something that was unchanging. Theology was viewed as a series of statements about God that were often universal and timeless. History was often viewed as a timeline that was neutral, a place where truths about God were often discovered or revealed to humanity through revelation. But as we began to discover that life changes and evolves throughout time, we also began to recognize that things like culture and tradition and really even knowledge itself also changes and evolves through time. The Enlightenment and the rise of rationalism played a huge role in challenging what we could know to be true. This threw into question many of the things that were previously assumed about the authority of Scripture, the authority of the church, and how we could know God through revelation. For many, this shift was absolutely devastating, and would eventually give rise to new forms of theology that sought to reconstruct a system of belief after the Enlightenment. For many, the Enlightenment had essentially killed God, paving way for a secular future that had little to no room for theological discourse. And if the Enlightenment had torn apart many of the foundations that theologians had built their systems of belief off of, Friedrich Schleiermacher was one of the first to come along and try to put those pieces back together again. Friedrich Schleiermacher, often referred to as one of the pioneers of modern theology, was an early 19th century German theologian who believed that theology was deeply contextual. He believed that theology was always affected by our historical location as well as our social location. In other words, for Schleiermacher, theology was always specific to a particular people in a particular place in a particular time in history. This way of viewing theology led him to believe that hermeneutics was something that could be used to rediscover value and meaning in the Christian tradition. Hermeneutics means to interpret something or to discover the meaning of something. To put it simply, hermeneutics is a study of interpretation. It helps us to understand that almost every field of study is mediated through concrete traditions that feature both a historical legacy as well as a continual process of intersubjective conversation. Intersubjective conversations meaning conversations in which we agree with one another. This could be social norms or a shared sense of meaning or what we might otherwise think of as common sense. To give an example, when I try to sit down to read and comprehend Shakespeare, I'm engaging in the practice of hermeneutics. Imagine if I sat down on a rainy day with Shakespeare's Macbeth in my hands, and I open it up to Act 1 and I begin to read. Act 1, Scene 1. Desert place. Thunder and lightning enter witches. Immediately, I'm creating my own interpretation of the text. The format of the text reminds me of texts that I read in high school. My previous knowledge of witches causes me to think about little old ladies with warty faces and a big nose who may have green skin and a pointy hat. And all of this shapes the way that I interpret the text. Now, if I had a class on Shakespeare in college, I might be informed on the historical and the social, political context that Shakespeare was writing in. I would know that the reign of King James I was full of fear and chaos, and I would read Macbeth as a cautionary tale towards folks like Guy Fawkes and others who are thinking about overthrowing the king. This multi-level method of interpretation is an example of what hermeneutics looks like in action. This means that theology always involves the act of interpretation, as it's important to keep the context in mind. This helps us to understand that knowledge and subsequently theology reflects a general sense of meaning as well as specific interests and desired outcomes. Revelation is never simply objective facts about God. Most are attempts to interpret those events in history where individuals or communities believe that God's identity has been revealed. This means that revelation always involves some sort of interpretation. As David Tracy suggests, in order to understand our present situation, indeed to experience it, we must interpret it. Interpretation is not something added on to experience and understanding, but it is always already present as intrinsic to understanding itself. This ultimately means that every interpretation of Scripture, of God, or the Christ event will reflect a specific understanding of the Christian tradition, as well as the cultural context from which the theologian operates. This inevitably results in different theologies. To give an example, for a really long time, biblical scholars and theologians interpreted Paul in a very specific way. But when biblical scholars began to interpret Paul's letters in light of his Jewish context, a completely new understanding of what Paul was trying to communicate arose. This is what's commonly referred to as the new perspective on Paul. I'm not going to get into the nuances between this old perspective and the new perspective, but the idea is that when you have different worldviews, different ways of life, and different perspectives, it often leads you to interpret things differently, and these different interpretations often lead to different theological beliefs. Both history and culture are always already present, but must be interpreted and assessed by the community. The idea is to always recognize the context of the whole in relation to its parts, and to simultaneously recognize the parts in relationship to the whole. This creates a feedback loop known as the Hermetic Circle, which suggests that the more we learn about one, the more that this informs what we know about the other. Again, David Tracy helps us by putting it this way. Whenever we interpret contemporary experience theologically, the history of effects of the Christian tradition is also present in the interpretation itself. Whenever we interpret the Christian message theologically, we inevitably also apply it to our contemporary experience in order to understand it all. To ignore these implicit dynamics between history and culture is to embrace a fundamentalism that embodies serious misinterpretations of both. While hermeneutics is only one of many ways that theologians have responded to the challenges of the Enlightenment, it's incredibly important to understand if we wish to critically engage in modern theological discourse. It's challenged the way that we study the Bible, forcing us to recognize that not only does the biblical canon have its own history and cultural context from which it arose, but the books themselves are written to a particular people in a particular place in history. It's helped us to explore new ways of finding meaning in the Christian tradition, allowing us to recognize the important role that tradition plays in helping us to ask the right questions. And hermeneutics plays an important role in helping us to deconstruct and pull apart oppressive readings of the Bible and the Christian tradition, making it a central part of many different theologies of liberation. In this video, we learned that hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. And even though it's a simple concept, it has huge impacts on the way that we do theology today. We learned that we're always interpreting the world around us, and that those interpretations are often filtered through our experiences and understandings of the world. And we learned that hermeneutics allowed theologians like Friedrich Schleiermacher to respond to some of the challenges of the Enlightenment. If you want to continue learning more about this topic, I highly recommend checking out some of the links in the description below. And as always, if you enjoyed watching this video, comment, subscribe, like this video, and consider supporting us on Patreon, which you can also find out more in the description below.